Hello and welcome to the New Food Hub. I'm Billy Nichols. I'm a content creator for the New Food Hub, and I'm joined today by Jenny Chapman, food systems researcher and author of a new report on ultra-processed foods, which are also known as UPFs. In her report, Processing the Discourse Over Plant-Based Meat, Jenny calls for a nuanced and science-backed approach to tackling concerns regarding alternative proteins that are perceived as ultra-processed. It's full of actionable insights and practical next steps for a range of food systems stakeholders, all with the aim of building acceptance and trust in plant-based meats and tackling concerns regarding ultra-processed foods. So Jenny, thank you for speaking to the New Food Hub.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, wonderful. Let's get stuck in. Let's start with the definition. There's a lot of confusion surrounding the precise definition of an ultra-processed food. So to start with, what's the definition that you've used in this report?
Yeah, it's a really good point. There are several definitions that are used, but by far and away, the one that's used most often was developed by a Brazilian guy called Carlos Monteiro. And ultra-processed food is part of a framework that he developed called the NOVA system. Now, NOVA means new in Portuguese. And there are 4 categories within this NOVA system. They're called NOVA 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the NOVA 4 category is what he called ultra-processed food. Now, the definition is really long. It's like 7 paragraphs long, so I won't read it out now. But basically, it touches on lots of different things. It touches on how a food is marketed, how a food is packaged, how it's processed, and how it's formulated. It's quite subjective. It uses phrases like many or usually or some. And because it's really quite unwieldy, it's really long, lots of people have come up with shorthand. So you might have seen things like, oh, it's wrapped in plastic, or it's got more than 5 ingredients, or it contains something you can't pronounce.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's really interesting to hear how that definition has developed over time. Now, in your report, you remind us that the term ultra-processed food was developed as a socio-political framework, not strictly a nutritional one. That was really interesting. So can you provide some more context on how the UPF classification was created?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is really key to understanding, again, where this confusion had come from. So Carlos Monteiro developed this framework in 2009. So he was seeing these big changes in Brazil, in the food system in Brazil where he was living. And he saw that people were shifting from diets that were traditional foods like rice and beans to eating things like fast food. So in his 2009 paper, it's really interesting to go back and look at it, because you can see he's really concerned about things like changes to social life. He has concerns about how people aren't cooking together anymore. He's concerned about things like food cultures changing. And then he's also concerned about health. He's concerned about diabetes and obesity in particular. And what it seems he wanted to do was solve all of these problems by coming up with a way of categorizing foods that he saw were responsible for everything from the changes to food culture to people not cooking together. And he developed this idea of ultra-processed food. And it's basically a really good way of identifying foods that are made in factories by large companies. And a phrase that he uses in his definition is he talks about foods for where there are no domestic equivalents. He's kind of saying these are foods that you or I couldn't or wouldn't make in our own kitchen. So that's a really useful socio-political framework. If you want to know, is something made in a factory, it works brilliantly for that. And Monteiro, in his 2009 paper, he literally states in the title, he says, the issue is with processing, not nutrients. And his definition was not intended to group foods on the basis of how healthy they are. Because when you look at it, it's grouping together foods like infant formula and baked beans and wholemeal bread and plant-based meat, which we'll be talking about, along with things that are junk foods that we know are high in fat, salt and sugar, so things like crisps and chocolate.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important distinction. So thank you for making that. Let's come forward to today then. Can you sketch out from that historical context that you provided the debate playing out today regarding ultra-processed foods and plant-based meats? So what claims are being made and in what ways have they become in some ways misleading?
Yeah, definitely. So lots of plant-based meats are ultra-processed food. If we use Monteiro's definition, they're things that you or I probably couldn't make in our own kitchen. The messaging, however, has been quite warped from Monteiro's sort of initial way in which he intended it to be used. And also the definition has been really, really closely linked to plant-based meat in particular. So the British Nutrition Foundation surveyed a group of people and said, what do you think are some commonly consumed ultra-processed foods? And after ready meals, the second most common thing that they stated was plant-based meat. So the citizens out there really have made this link between ultra-processing and plant-based meat. The claims that people are making are really, really varied. So there's lots and lots of reasons why people might dislike something that's ultra processed. Some people are really concerned about the plastic packaging that's being used. Some people have concerns like Montero about changes to sort of indigenous food cultures. Some people have some concerns about the idea that these are big multinational companies, and sort of their concerns are more sort of political and capitalist in nature. Other people are concerned about additives. And then there's also lots of concerns about how these products are not natural. And I mean, the definition of natural is it's in the eye of the beholder, so that's a very tricky one. But I'm particularly interested in the concerns to do with food safety and food health. Now, this is where using Nova is not particularly helpful because, as we've said, Nova wasn't meant to identify foods that are or aren't healthy. So it's not really fair for us to criticize a classification for being bad at something it was never intended to do. But yeah, the messaging out there is generally focusing on how all ultra-processed foods are unnatural and unhealthy, which obviously isn't the case.
Brilliant. Thank you for that context. Really helpful and interesting. Let's move on to your recommendations. Now, your report makes 5 key recommendations to build acceptance and trust around plant-based meats. And at the New Food Hub, we love actionable insights like these. So I think they're worth quoting in full. I'll read them out now. So you recommend 1, promote foods that are both healthier and more sustainable, irrespective of their degree of processing. 2, communicate nuance with care regarding nutrition and ultra-processed food. Number 3, normalize and actively develop trust in plant-based meats. 4, improve awareness of nutrition and food processing to help consumers adopt healthier and more sustainable diets. And 5, invest in research and development to provide consumers with healthier, more sustainable and more affordable foods. So some really interesting and important recommendations there. So let's delve into them in some more detail now. Starting with communication, this is obviously something a lot of plant-based meat companies are thinking about at the moment. So my question is, what responsibilities and capabilities do different food system stakeholders have when it comes to this nuanced communication?
Yeah, I think all stakeholders have a lot to do here. In general, consumers often don't have a great idea about how their food is made. This is sometimes referred to as like the black box or the missing middle. So this idea that people perhaps think of their food on a farm or in a field, and then they see it in the supermarket, and what happens in between is a bit unclear. And I think that lack of knowledge can lead to distrust in the food system, when actually food processing, the way that food is made, is absolutely essential for things like safety, and it allows our food to be stored and transported. So we really should have more trust in it. So I think, yeah, a lot of stakeholders need to work together here. I'd love to see plant-based meat companies communicate to their consumers a bit more about how the products are made to demystify the process. Because I think compared to perhaps conventional meat products, where people do think that they have an idea how you go from an animal to, say, a sausage or a burger, perhaps people are less sure about how you go from some soy protein or some wheat protein to a plant-based product. I think it would also be fantastic in terms of other stakeholders to see government departments producing some really clear and objective fact files for some commonly consumed foods, how they're made right from farm to fork. I'd love to see this talked about more in schools. I think it's really important that young people develop trust in the food system and could go on perhaps school trips to farms or to crop processing facilities or factory farms or packing facilities or slaughterhouses, so that they see this is our incredible modern food system, and this is how it gets from farm to fork. I think it'd be really cool to see an exhibition about this. I'd love to see one of the big museums producing an exhibition about how amazing food processing is. But yeah, lots of people in the food system need to work together to normalize these processes and build trust.
Brilliant, thank you. And you talked a little bit about the role of plant-based meat companies there, but I saw some really interesting things in your report about the ways plant-based meat companies could communicate their products and build trust. Is there anything else you want to add on that question?
Yeah, definitely. So I think plant-based meat is such an exciting sector. It's still quite a new sector. So because it's new, some of the products they might be perceived to be novel. And I think there's lots of examples historically where people can distrust sort of novel foods. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. If we think if we've not tried something, we want to be sure that it's safe and it's good for us. So I think there's lots of opportunities to encourage people to try these safe and healthy products in lots and lots of different settings. But I think also plant-based meat companies, they need to be really proud of this amazing technology that they've developed and explain this process. And they can do this perhaps through having some really clear, frequently asked questions on their websites. In my report, I provided some examples of some of the questions that they might like to tackle in that. But yeah, there's lots and lots of ways in which they can normalize these processes and really show people what's going on and sort of demystify that black box a little bit.
Yeah, brilliant. So do download the report on the new Food Hub website to see those specific recommendations. Now, when it comes to the normalization of plant-based meat, your report makes some clear recommendations. One is that there should be a transition from conventional meat to plant-based meat in institutional catering, in food service, and in retail settings. Now, that's an admirable goal, but no mean feat either. So what can plant-based meat companies and other stakeholders do to try and facilitate that transition?
Sure, yeah. So I think plant-based meat companies can work really closely with food service companies and also people like white and private label manufacturers. And I think there's a real opportunity for them to go to their chefs and say, look, here are the products, or the people who do their new product development and say, look, here's our products or here's our ingredients. This is how you cook it. This is how you make it delicious. They can taste it with them and be there to answer those questions so that the people who are buying these products and cooking these products are really confident about what they are and what's in them. And also just explaining all of the benefits that we know about health, about sustainability, about things like zoonotic diseases and antibiotic resistance, but also for food service companies, there's benefits like having less kitchen contamination if they're using plant-based products. I think there's also some fun opportunities to kind of work with these companies to introduce these into really traditional dishes or dishes that are served during particular times of the year or religious holidays to show that it's possible to make these like-for-like swaps.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of potential there. Thank you. Now, you also give some specific recommendations surrounding normalization to media stakeholders. So what's their role in building trust and convention around plant-based meats?
Yeah, I think this has the potential to be huge. I think it'd be amazing to see everything from radio programs to soap operas to films or adverts transitioning anytime they're talking about food or conventional meat, just instead talking about plant-based food, especially in cooking shows. I think it'd be brilliant for people to see that these products can be like-for-like swaps. An example, I saw the new Mean Girls film recently. It's excellent. And in the film, one of the first things I noticed was that they were drinking oat milk in the school canteen. I just thought this is a fantastic example of just normalizing plant-based products and just showing that we don't need to change our eating behavior. We don't need to change societal norms. We just make these really easy swaps.
Fascinating. Yeah, well, what an interesting example. And I can't wait to see what more come with media. Okay, we also need to improve awareness of nutrition and food processing. So how can caterers and plant-based meat companies, for example, work together to advance this goal?
Definitely, yeah. So plant-based meat companies can make sure that the information about the nutrition of their products is really easily available. They really need to win on the health front. These products are almost always healthier than the conventional meat products they're replacing. So I really would love to see them shout more about that and really boast about those attributes of their products. And of course, caterers, large-scale caterers and food service companies need to provide balanced meals to their customers. And I think showing that the plant-based meat can be a really healthy protein source here is a great opportunity to get it into a really sort of large-scale system.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for your research, your report, and your recommendations. It's been fascinating hearing your thoughts here. And if anyone wants to read more, please do download the report on the new Food Hub website. To close off, I want to ask you one last question. If you had to pick one quality or perspective that you think is currently lacking in the ultra-processed food debate at present and could enhance it, what would it be and why?
Yeah, interesting one. I would go with I think the idea that products have lots of ingredients is a really interesting thing to unpick. It's really interesting to just take a moment and think, what do we mean when we say an ingredient? Because if I was to pick up a banana or an egg or some beef mince or a plant-based product, full of loads of different molecules. And however, if I was to look at an ingredients list for a banana or an egg or some beef mince or a plant-based product, those ingredients lists would look really, really, really different. And I think it's fascinating to think about how what we see on a label and the ingredients on a packet is much more of a reflection of sort of our legal system than perhaps an accurate representation of what's in a food. And the reason I'm interested in this is that when I was researching concerns about ultra-processed products, I was often seeing the message that people were concerned that these things had too many ingredients. But I think it's really interesting to push back a bit there and say, okay, let's think a bit more critically. What do you mean by the word ingredient?
Fascinating. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for speaking to the New Food Hub.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks, Billy.